Hello and welcome to this virtual public seminar featuring Antoine Bousquet and Jairus on Martial Autonomies, Rise of the War Machines. My name is Michael Richardson and I'm a Senior Research Fellow in the School of the Arts and Media at UNSW Sydney and a co-director of the Media Futures Hub. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from unceded Bedegal country in the lands of the Eora people in what is now called Sydney, Australia. The struggle for justice for Indigenous rights continues in Australia and around the world. So this is the second of 6 seminars on the theme of drone futures. Drones are crucial to the future of war, but also of everything from policing to agriculture to conservation. Drones are reshaping how the world is perceived, how people are governed, and how power is enacted and resisted. Yet they remain elusive, thanks in part to their diversity, constant evolution, and in the military context, their disappearance from view. From the neo-colonial violence of contemporary wars in the Middle East and Africa to the strange histories of unmanned aerial vehicles to resistant art practices, this seminar series looks to the past and present to think into the future. And the aim is that by showcasing scholarship from multiple disciplines, we can spark new connections and stimulate debate about how to build more just drone futures. So the seminar series is hosted by the Media Futures Hub at UNSW, and it's funded by an Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Researcher Award that I hold for a project about drones and witnessing in war and culture. So thank you, ARC. If you'd like to know more about that project or to see the upcoming Drone Futures seminars, you'll find a link below the video if you click Show More. It's a really exciting lineup, today's seminar included. And you can also read there about the symposium on drone cultures that will follow this seminar series in December. So today we're going to hear from Antoine Bousquet and Jairus, who I think are 2 of the most fascinating thinkers in international relations and critical security studies today. Antoine is Reader in International Relations at Birkbeck College, University of London, and he's the author of The Eye of War, Military Perception from the Telescope to the Drone, which is a deeply researched and carefully argued exploration of what Antoine calls the martial gaze. Jairus is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He's the author of Savage Ecology, War and Geopolitics at the End of the World, which is one of the most startling and unsettling works of political theory of recent times, and a book that has really helped me think through how to understand where we're at in geopolitics and the life of war today. I have to say I'd be really pleased to have either Antoine or Jairus speaking here individually, but to have them together is really amazing because they've both in different ways helped my understanding of war and technology tremendously. So before I hand over to them though, I'll just describe the format. So you're all on YouTube, obviously, and not here in this Zoom call with us. And so while it would be nice to have more voices speaking and so on, the number of people and connections in the call can make that kind of messy. So on YouTube, you've got access to the chat, and that chat is being moderated by Madeline Weber. She's a PhD candidate at UNSW, and she's working with me on this drones project. So Madeline will be following along and diving into the chat, and she'll feed your comments and questions into the Zoom. So while this is maybe a little less intimate than a discussive big Zoom call, we're hoping it'll help the discussion flow smoothly. And it also means you can chat during the talk and kind of have side conversation without disturbing anyone. Now, the format today is that Antoine and Jairus will each offer some opening remarks, and then they will kind of respond to one another, and then we'll pick up into a kind of free-flowing conversation. So I might ask some questions, they might have questions for one another, and you might have questions for them. So it won't be that typical strict format of or more strict format of a talk followed by a Q&A. And we'll sort of see how things unfold over the time that we have available to us. So without further ado, Antoine Bousquet and Jairus with Martial Autonomies, Rise of the War Machines.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for inviting us, yourself, the centre, and of course, the University of New South Wales. It's always a pleasure to kind of talk about things with Jairus. We do it quite often. Doing it in public is perhaps a slightly different experience. So hopefully it'll be as enjoyable for you as it is for us. I guess I'll start with a few kind of preliminary thoughts on the question of drones and autonomy. And the first thing, and I think it's important to get this out of the way, even though maybe at this point it's become obvious to most, is that we have to be careful when we talk about drones to not become kind of fetishistic about the object. There's already, I think, a long history of unmanned aerial vehicles that shows that although these objects have come really to public attention and to even scholarly attention in the last 10, 15 years, really, they reach all the way back from the very beginnings of air power. And similarly, I think it's very important to underline that really the drone is a concatenation of technologies. It's not a fixed object in itself. And we need to be very attentive to these wider technologies, the histories of these technologies, the networks in which the drone as an object is embedded in. And I think that's kind of important to just lay that out there, because I think once we start framing things in this way, we get to, I think, more essential considerations about where these technologies might be heading. And particularly, of course, today we're talking about this question of autonomy, which is very much tied to debates about artificial intelligence or lethal autonomous weapon systems, as we found in the debates. And the first thing I would do, I guess, would be to make something like a deflationist move. And first thing would be to say that on one level, autonomous weapon systems are not future devices. They already exist. They're already deployed in certain restricted contexts. So we find them in anti-aerial defenses or as sentry guns. And this really goes back to the late 70s and 80s. We can find some of these systems. And while there's a lot of heat around the idea of lethal autonomous weapon systems, here we're talking about systems that are no doubt fallible, but operate in relatively simple environments in which the presence of non-belligerence is generally unlikely. So these systems might not destroy enemy targets, but the risk of so-called collateral damage is limited, and effectively we're in spaces where these machines, the automation of these systems becomes often a kind of operational necessity. What we really are talking about most of the time when we think about lethal autonomous systems are about systems whose artificial intelligence would allow it to make complex decisions, discriminations about targets, and the ability to identify targets in crowded battle spaces where there might be many illegitimate targets as well. And here, I think the claims often we have to be wary of is that really there's a lot of AI boosterism, that if you look at the history of AI, military and otherwise, and you think about the kind of problems that these AIs would have to solve in these types of environments, if you're asking these systems to discriminate, to conform to laws of war, really you're asking for quite considerable advances on current AI, whether it's in the realm of computer vision or synthetic reasoning. And we should have a degree of skepticism to the extent to which this AI is around the corner in any meaningful sense. I'll make a point here as well that we should note that the real challenge here is discrimination. Right? We already know how to indiscriminately target on a massive scale. If militaries did not care about carpet bombing places or mass indiscriminate targeting, the problem of AI would be a fairly straightforward and simple one. Or you maybe wouldn't even need AI in the first place. So I think it's important to note that this is a big part of the operational context for these technologies. So for all these reasons, militaries are on the whole not exceedingly keen to forego human control if the technology is still error prone. There are major problems, of course, for militaries themselves, for institutions within militaries and for the people who send militaries out in deploying autonomous weapon systems. The major problems are really surrounding issues of accountability. If things go wrong, who is responsible? And my sense is actually part of the problem we have, or the danger we have in focusing on lethal autonomous weapon systems, is that in many ways we might be missing what is the more immediate challenge and danger, which is to say, I think humans are likely to stay on the loop for quite a long time, that both for practical but also for political and institutional reasons, militaries will want to have humans involved in the process at some level or another, authorizing the use of weapon systems. But what is happening and what will continue to happen is that these individuals are becoming ever more tightly embedded within the socio-technical assemblage of the weapon. And this, I think, is really the nub of the issue, that when we think about these systems, when we think about the ways in which humans are embedded in wider meshworks of technologies, of cybernetic control systems, and so forth, and in artificial intelligence, we find it ever more difficult to identify the locus of agency in these systems, certainly at a kind of functional level. At a legal level, it may be very practical for institutions to say, well, here's the human, if something went wrong, here's the human decision maker that we can blame. But effectively, of course, if human decision makers within military systems are increasingly finding that the operational environment is being mediated, oriented, and informed by AI, then it becomes much more difficult to legitimately see a human decision maker as a kind of sovereign decision maker involved in that process. And so I'd be tempted to say that actually the question of autonomy is perhaps the wrong question for us to ask, or at least that we really need to think carefully about what we mean by autonomy. Because when we think about the ways that, it strikes me that when we talk about autonomy in the context of military systems and machines, is that our conception of machine autonomy seems to be effectively modeled on our understanding of human autonomy. This is quite an anthropomorphic conceit, that we should think that machines should, the idea of an autonomous machine must be somehow equivalent to what we think is an autonomous human. And I think we've got time to revisit that as well. I think Jairus may say some things about that, but I think there's no necessary reason to think that our machines, and as they are evolving, will develop human forms of deliberation and cognitive decision making. So I think there's a first problem here in mapping human conceptions of autonomy onto machines in a straightforward fashion. But this raises, I think, a secondary issue, perhaps even more fundamental issue, which is that perhaps this conception of human autonomy is flawed as regards humans as well. There's been work in philosophy in 15, 20 years, or further back, if you look to its roots, that really makes the argument that human cognition is not a process that happens only within the confines of our bodies, that we really are extended selves, that all cognition, and this is one of the chief characteristics of, or at least that humans have developed most intensively, is that cognition is something that takes place in interaction with our environment. And think at the very basic level about the activity of writing, which is an externalization of thought onto the material world. Of making sums on paper or drawing on the sand. These are very basic cognitive tasks, but they do not simply happen in our head. They happen in conversation or in engagement with our environment. And here, the work of people like Andy Clark or Edwin Hutchins, I think, is very important for us. And it is, I think, more broadly a testament to the unique plasticity of the human species, that we have developed this interaction, this development of our beings in constant dialogue, in constant engagement with our environment. The late Bernard Stiegler made the point that the anthropogenesis is deeply intertwined with technogenesis. I think we want to think about the trajectory of human evolution and of our technical evolution. We have to be mindful of this, that the cognitive processes at the heart of our societies and our own sense of being are not things that are confined to a human body or mind. Now, current technologies are really an extension of this. I talked about very early types of technologies. The technologies that are appearing now are a further extension of this process of combined anthropogenesis and technogenesis. Now, that's not to say that nothing has changed. I think the ties, the deepening of these interactions is ever greater. The environment, through the kind of development of cybernetic systems, we have environments that are, not simply reflecting mutely what we impress on them, but are themselves processing and sending information back that we didn't necessarily put into it. But this, I think, means that when we think about our, human autonomy, autonomy it's never been something that was a pristine quality of human beings. It is not in itself a discrete quality that beings either possess or not. You are either autonomous or you are not. It's always been a contingent, situated, graduated, emergent property. Or to think in other words, agency is always something that is assembled from the world, from the fabric of society, and as capaciously as we can understand the idea of society or collectives. And so the same is very true of the AIs we are setting loose in the world. They will also evolve and gain forms of autonomy in relationship to the world in which they're set in, the wider networks of connections that they make. So I think we may want to, and I'll conclude on this for the moment, we may want to think preferably in terms of autonomies, not a quality of autonomy, but a field of autonomies that will coalesce from the entanglement of humans and machines. And that, I think, raises a whole set of complicated analytical questions, but I think it gets us closer to the heart of the matter and thinking in kind of binary, absolutist terms about this idea of autonomy. Over to you, Jairus.
Awesome. Sorry it took me that long to figure out how to unmute, which the autonomous Zoom system told me I hadn't done several times. So I think, there's a great deal of overlap, I think, where Antoine and I's thinking has converged on drones. So I'm going to try to boil it down and overlap as little as possible, but come back to some of the central points. So there's sort of four main areas, I think, which are also in some sense a deflationary move. But like Antoine's point, the deflationary move is not necessarily good news. So I think that's one of the things that often these debates happen over sort of autonomy versus automation. What kinds of limits, can we have ethical software? The skepticism tends to be on the side of, oh, well, these systems can't work, so we're fine. Or these systems can really do these amazing transformative things, so we're fine. And I think Antoine's point and my point coming soon is something like, well, they may not work at all like we think they are, and that's not necessarily good or bad news. It's a radically different way of thinking about what machines can do to warfare and the political. So I've got sort of four core areas I'll introduce quickly and then go through. And then I want to do a little bit of painting a picture of where I think transformations could take place and what the drivers for those transformations would be. So the first one, which I think Antoine touched on at the beginning, which is something like drone essentialism. We have a tendency to want to think about the drone as a thing, right? We want to think about it as, fundamentally a predator drone or, one of the quadcopters that we see constantly at the beach. But the reality is that the drone's only interesting not because it's a thing, but precisely because of what it can be plugged into. And Antoine gave lots of great examples of the ways in which it really doesn't even make sense as an object without the vast network of satellites that we have, the ability to have telecommunications in real time. What are, for me, the most interesting, which is that what's really become more sophisticated with drones is their sensory capabilities. But if we're going to try to unpack drone essentialism, I want to go a little bit further, and I'll come back to that because I want you to sort of think about all of these together. The second major area is this idea of autonomy versus automation, and getting past the idea that these are in some sense opposed terms or even dialectical terms. I think the more that we come to understand how human cognition works, the more that we understand that autonomy and automation are actually mutually dependent upon one another. And I'll get back to some of the points that Antoine raised about agency and where that comes in. Number three, which I'll spend some time on too, intelligence. Why intelligence is at the center of this. And I think this gets to the question of the sort of human and the sort of anthropocentric nature of our research, but also the anthropomorphic expectations we have of the future. And the fourth, which I'll definitely spend some time on when I talk about the future, is what I would like to call the functionalist fallacy. Which is often at play amongst futurists who I spend a lot of time with, which is that things will be used if they work. What we don't spend a lot of time thinking about is failure and what things do when they don't work. All right, so I want to start with drone essentialism and maybe introduce some ideas that could change our expectations of the future and also think differently about drones. The first drone that I want to talk about, which doesn't get a lot of airplay these days, are landmines. Landmines are one of the most highly distributed drones in the world. And what I mean by drone is they're a weapon in waiting. In some cases, just again recently, a Confederate US landmine was discovered in the South, and it was still explosive. It was waiting in some sense to have a kind of sensory experience, right? Now, the sensory experience in this case, thankfully, it was so deep that no one was able to set it off. But when they go off in places like Cambodia or in Vietnam or in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's because something agitated them. They had the capacity to feel, right? So they are tactile drones. If we look and think about the ways in which the improvised explosive device has changed over the last decade, right? Going from being in some sense just either radio controlled or wire controlled landmines to now being aerial drones, right? So we have in many cases instances in which sort of suicide drones, which functionally are just landmines that can fly. So I want to keep that there, because really what then happens is not this sort of sensory change, right? We have an incredibly long history of weapons that have a certain sensory capability, right? They can decide to go off or not go off based on the presence of a particular kind of network or encounter. But there's a kind of obsession with the flying drone because we have an obsession with mobility, and I think that actually is somewhat misleading and not terribly helpful. The second drone that somehow falls out of the picture entirely because we don't have the same sense of intelligence, although it could become quite intelligent, which we should get out of if we want to get out of drone essentialism, is nuclear weapons, right? Incredible sophistication in targeting, the ability to retarget in many cases, to be in constant communication with those that fire them, to have capacities to overcome or even deploy countermeasures, depending upon the kinds of encounters they make, and the renaissance that we're having right now in nuclear weapons, even as we traditionally understand them, right? As we understand them for instance, intercontinental ballistic missiles, but already debates about whether or not Russia has developed the capacity for what amount to nuclear drones, right? Deep submersible warheads, which can stay underwater indefinitely because they don't have crews, and an era in which we could quite imagine submarines with nuclear capability and never having the need to come above water, right? Does that fit the kind of model we have the drone? I don't think so, but those are the kinds of drones which I think could really alter or change. And the last one's kind of wacky, but I want to think about it, which is there's a kind of cousin to the drone that we often don't think about, which is the way that animals were used consistently in warfare, in many cases even to deploy weapons. We know for sure that there's a very advanced marine mammal program, both in Russia and the United States, as well as some smaller programs in Iran. In fact, the marine mammal program in the US is housed mostly in Hawaii. And what was so attractive to using seals and dolphins and even some small whales was precisely their capacity for autonomy, that they had decision-making capabilities, that their training could become improvised. And there are even some rumors that some of the most crazy nuclear scenarios that people thought about mounting small warheads to rather larger whales who would deliver them without being able to be picked up by sensors. So what does it mean to get out of, I think, the sort of sleek notion of the Predator drone and think more about this wider array, not just the network it lives in, but the kinds of everyday drones which have become quite normalized as components of war, but have precisely changed the temporality and in some sense, the human character of war. If we think about human and humanity as a time scale, right? So landmines that can live for decades, even 100 years, animals that may function on different scales, and weapons that may lie in wait, even accidentally, which could alter the course of warfare. Part 2, autonomy versus automation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I do want to think, I was really provoked by Catherine Malibu's latest book on AI. And, given the work she's been doing on neuroplasticity and been quite critical of cybernetics, she makes a bit of a turn and really takes seriously that cybernetics was on to some very interesting things when it came to understanding not just the nature of human cognition, but just the problem of cognition. And that what's obviously clear is how dependent even our most Enlightenment notions of freedom are on a vast autonomic system, which if it were not completely automated, we couldn't think at all, right? If we had to remind ourselves to breathe, if we had to think or cogitate when deciding whether or not to dodge out of the way of a car, if we had to, in some sense, coordinate what Immanuel Kant called the spontaneous accord of the faculties, right? The fact that they all get along, communicate, and make sense, there would be no thought and freedom in the first place, which is another way of saying, and this is Malibu's point, if humans were not almost entirely automated, autonomy would be entirely impossible. So trying to get out of the sense that something is autonomous or is automated and thinking instead about nested levels of autonomy and automation and what that makes possible. I think that's particularly important for thinking about the future of drones because we tend to think that drones will make this sort of step change when something like a fully formed AI gets implanted into a highly capable machine, instead of thinking about the ways in which an incredibly sophisticated set of sensory capabilities, reaction capabilities. So for instance, drones can fly themselves through storms, take off and land, process data, potentially go silent when they could be targeted by different kinds of weapons. That it's actually the interplay of those autonomous capabilities, or rather those automated capabilities, that make something emergent like autonomy possible. Part 3, intelligence. I think this is another area of not just drone essentialism, but AI essentialism, which is really unhelpful. And it's exactly what Antoine said, which is it's this sort of inherited notion, not of actual human intelligence, but our self sort of sense of what our intelligence is, which I think actually has more to do with the reason why we've had an AI sort of long winter than the technical challenges. It's that we're actually looking for the wrong thing. And so I want to add 2 different possibilities which would alter the way that we might think about drone development. The first one is, why aren't we talking about modeling desire? Desire is also incredibly complex, hard to understand. If we're Freudians, we want to think about desire in its relationship to drive. If we're Lacanians, we want to think about the way that a lack produces this almost exuberant attempt to fill in what isn't present. If we're Deleuzians or Batailleans, and we want to think about desire as these sort of explosive or productive forces, in which expenditure is actually the thing which not only is desired, but produces, in some sense, limited moments of rest from, and in some cases, a kind of subordination by desire. Imagine those things, those different models of how we understand what makes us want things being modeled into machines. It's seemingly less sophisticated than intelligence, but one can imagine on the battlefield what it would mean to desire to kill, to desire to hunt, to desire to find, to desire to reproduce, to desire not to die, to repair, how these things might change things fundamentally. And the last one is actually much more simple than desire, and it's my little pitch for thinking about the sort of biomimetics. Maybe we'll talk about it more in the Q&A, but the attempts to desire not single animals, but collectives of animals. So wolf packs, bee swarms, thinking about how different components work together and create, in some sense, an emergent intelligence, which again has to be highly automated, right? If bees thought things through themselves, it would go badly. But what if we simply were able to model hunger? I think that would be revolutionary. Last thing, the fundamentalist fallacy, or rather the functionalist fallacy, that we'll only do things because they work, or the sort of correlate, the sort of fallacy of design, we'll only do those things which we decide to do. And that's where I'll leave a couple of drivers, and then I'll save the discussion of the relationship between machine and politics for Antoine and I's discussion. A couple of drivers which I think will fundamentally alter the course of drone history. I think COVID is something we're already seeing, and it's sort of a backdoor to the conversation that I wanted to have about the political and war and people, which is that drones aren't just automating war, they're also experiencing an automation of labor. It's all labor, is another way to put it. And if it's all labor, and increasingly we have reasons why we don't want people interacting with each other, or we don't want people directly participating in the acts that they are. Imagine, for instance, not just giving this Zoom call, but needing to operate things via Zoom, mechanical devices. We could quite literally lose the kinds of capacities we have for direct encounter with decision-making. We could lose the capacities we have for civil unrest. We could lose the capacities we have for direct action and other forms of protests that are somehow short of war. So I think that's one driver. It's not just COVID as this particular instance, but the sort of constant disruption and necessity to rely increasingly on non-human forms of labor, which could be highly disruptive. The second one is hypersonic weapons. I think as weapons become faster, the necessity to rely on increasing levels of automation will produce autonomy, meaning that because the devices themselves will have to retarget, will have to move, will have to cope with very small changes in the atmosphere, those kinds of decisions and deployments will alter our necessity to rely on weapon systems that don't necessarily work, but for whom we have no other choice but to try it. The last is that as miniaturization of drones happen more and more, as swarming of drones happen more and more, the only logical response will be more directed energy weapons, microwave weapons, electromagnetic pulses, lasers, all of which will drive the arms race in the opposite direction to make drones increasingly deaf and blind, meaning that they'll have to rely on their own cognitive capacities increasingly, because that will be the only way to create countermeasures from destroying them or knocking them out of the sky. If we think about that kind of environment, what we're looking towards is sort of increasing push towards automation broadly, and a disconnection from the state, an increasing speed of war, which I think Antoine's done a great job detailing in his own book, and a sort of necessity for drones to become less dependent on humans in the loop. Then I think we could see some futures which would be not exactly what we're expecting, but certainly different from what we have now. And I'll leave it at that.
If I can respond, there's a lot there, of course, but one thing I think you raised, Jairus, is very interesting, is this question of what or who counts as a drone. And here I'll note there's a kind of interesting tension here between this idea of, I mean, there's a kind of oxymoron or contradiction in terms, rather, between the idea of an autonomous drone, because what we usually think of as a drone in common parlance is precisely the opposite of autonomy. Is there's unthinking and unfree or merely going through rote motions. Context of what counts as autonomy and who's a drone, I think we'd be worth noting that autonomy within the military, if you think in historical terms, has always been very unevenly distributed. The great tactical and strategic determinations of generals have typically rested on the automatic execution of orders by the mass of soldiers. And that is what military discipline has through the ages generally required, that soldiers just execute orders, whether these orders are predetermined in advance, the clockwork armies of Frederick the Great in the 18th century, or whether they are to respond to orders that flow through the battlefield as the battle goes on. But ultimately, the autonomy of the soldier has very often been extremely restricted. And in fact, autonomy as general has been a compromise for many militaries. It's something that had to be given to soldiers because distance or restrictions of bandwidth did not allow the timely transmission of orders. So that if there are developments on the battlefield and effectively you can't get input from the commanders, then soldiers have to take some decisions themselves. So it's important to note that armies have always treated its human material as cogs within larger social machines. I refer here to Lewis Mumford's ideas of the mega machines, these vast social machines where humans are basically substitutes for cogs in a more literal machine. And a major driver from this perspective, a major driver of technological development has been the desire to remedy the fallibility of these human cogs. So, whether it's more efficient, faster, cheaper to get a technical object or any kind of more sophisticated machine to do what a human can do is really one of the big questions, or one of the big drivers of technology. But fundamentally, that doesn't really necessarily change the function of autonomy within the system, or the relationship of subordinate parts to maybe the autonomous or more autonomous decision makers within that. So, in talking about lethal autonomous weapon systems, we might fall prey of a kind of idealization of autonomy within the war machine that has always been a very partial and uneven property.
No, I totally agree. I mean, we were talking about this before, that the entire Marshall paradigm of training the point is to eliminate, in some sense, as much autonomy as possible. I was also thinking the sort of increasing reliance after World War II and all the studies on the failure to pull trigger rates, and the move to operator response techniques, right? So training soldiers not to aim first, but to fire first, right? So that more bullets would go onto the battlefield, or the uses of techniques of behavioralism to alter training, so that they no longer thought about themselves as shooting at a different person, right? The different ways in which we've learned to process guilt, memory, whether or not it's pharmaceutically, it's through therapy. I mean, the entire apparatus of making war something sustainable, as opposed to something traumatic and catastrophic, is a process of building human drones. And I mean, part of the sort of dream, in some sense, right, is of the sort of corporate soldier warrior who can, have this time at war and then come home somehow and sort of start their life over, is one where the training could be turned on and turned off. And so, I mean, I think that's also something that's important for getting out of the sort of drone essentialism box, right? The sort of shiny predator drone is, from 1947 or 8, basically, to the present, the entire obsession with the brain by the US military, whether or not it was John Lilly's research on how to hack dolphins and monkeys, how to build, human machine interface technology or machine animal interface technology, all of that was about how to modulate the relationship between autonomy and automation. And I mean, I think that's actually something that goes all the way down to the sort of thinking and planning also at the sort of program level for the military. I mean, think about all the fights we've had over the last 20 years over more special forces, more technological instead of special forces, or the kind of soft counterinsurgency revolution that we've had, and then that going back to kind of more air power, right? Those conversations are really, right, this torsion between, we want automated systems like air power, which we can measure very clearly and sort of tactically what the outcomes are, versus this sort of image of, Green Berets and Rangers who can think for themselves, or Navy SEALs who can kind of adapt to situations. And the drone seems more like a synecdoche, right? A sort of stand-in for that larger conversation about what war is supposed to be, right? Is it supposed to be this sort of creative apparatus that adapts to the battlefield and sort of creates constantly new tactical innovation, or is it a control mechanism, right? Is it the capacity, in some sense, to constrain the level of force and use of force, to have sort of gradual escalation and more sort of authority at the top and less autonomy at the bottom? And I think that gets to the core of the very nature of warfare. And I think a lot of, in some sense, paranoia about the drone, even more so than the drone itself. Not to say that the drone's a metaphor, because, Antoine and I, we don't like metaphors.
I mean, I agree with the tension here that you underline, which is, on the one hand, the military has for some time, and there was a report published by DARPA, the R&D arm of the military in the US back in the early 2000s, that bluntly stated the weakest link is the human. And you can see in lots of ways why the military might want to move the human out of the picture for problems of indecision, it's an ability to cope with perhaps a heightened speed in the battle space, just sheer cost as well. I mean, you think, AI and so on, our mind boggles at some of the money that's spent on weapon systems, but soldiers are extremely expensive for contemporary militaries. You have to train them, you have to support them through the deployment, but especially now you have to take care of them after they retire, and often sometimes with lifelong injuries and conditions. And it's been remarked that the only really socialized medical care you get in the US is as a member of the military. So the displacement of humans by machines is appealing in a number of ways, obviously for the military. Also, we're talking just on the rebounding on what you're saying about desire, and the problem of the shooter problem is, you have to create the desire or engineer the desire to kill, which can be quite a complicated thing to do, or at least an involved one, which you may not, obviously is a problem that doesn't necessarily arise in the same fashion, at least with machines. But parallel to this, we do live at a time where there is a greater emphasis than ever, I think, within the military on the role of creativity. I mean, movements such as the military design movement, emphasize creativity, and certainly, even kinds of heretical forms of creativity, which are, very much the kind of preserve at this point of the human. Now, there's debate, of course, how much this creativity and even to some extent insubordination within the military should be allowed to percolate down within the institution. But these trends are definitely happening concurrently. And some aspects of contemporary military deployment, such as special forces, seems to be the ones where the human will remain central for a very long time, even though it will be continually integrated with other technologies. Whereas air power obviously is the tip of the spear really for automation and perhaps even autonomy within the military.
Yeah, no, I totally, yeah. So here's the question though, there are moments where I think that's where everything's happening, because that's where the most intellectually interesting debates and like the sort of weirdest parts of the military are. I mean, DARPA is interesting because it's weird, right? It's seemingly creative, it's seemingly innovative. And then I come back to, the point that I was trying to make about nuclear weapons, which is like, can we really imagine caring that much about drones and the kind of limited capacities they could have if we were in nuclear battlefields? I mean, I can imagine the value of a drone in the sense that, humans wouldn't be able to exist in those battlefields. But in terms of the kinds of scale, right? So the other thing about the drone, and I think about the obsession of the drone that could be quite dangerous, is it presumes a scale and management of warfare that there's no reason to suspect will necessarily take place. And so I think the question is not just what drones can do and could do if their future developed, if they became highly intelligent. But could we really imagine, for instance, this would be sort of my counterexample, let's say the United States really gets its, third offset. And in fact, they skip ahead to the fourth offset. They have general AI, and they have the capacity for a central computer to not just think tactically, but also strategically, to innovate the ways in which it's fighting on the battlefield, but also the war aims themselves, right? That's sort of the vision, right? Something that could think sort of faster than its opponent. And let's say it got that huge advantage over Russia or China, and there was some kind of first move advantage to attacking. Do we really think that Russia or China wouldn't just say, well, that AI looks really, really impressive, and that's a lot of drones. I think we're going to use, multiple reentry vehicles with, 10, 20 megatons and just wipe it out, right? So like there's sort of a strange agreement, right? When we think about these sort of improvements of a certain kind of technology, that they'll happen within the boundaries of certain kinds of thinkable warfare. And so I also kind of wonder too, how much the drone is somewhat an aspirational weapon, in the sense that for all those states who invest heavily in it, it's also an attempt to invest heavily in small wars, right? Sort of manageable, low impact, very, very long-term wars. And potentially, and I know this has come up in some of the other drone talks and will come up certainly in other drone talks, that the drone may have less to do with war and more to do with security. That we may see it as a sort of revolutionary weapon, particularly its AI capacity, not in the fighting of adversaries, but in the maintenance of our own populations. And I think we've already begun to see the sort of the bare bones beginnings of that in the United States, where, you know, the continual aftermath of slavery that never ends in this country, that was once managed by trained dogs, and, you know, people wearing white hoods, is now managed by the capacity to scan cell phones, to use drones for surveillance, to think about putting dispersal weapons on drones like LRADs and microwave weapons, to manage borders. That it really, you know, we like to think in terms of warfare, but I do think that that in quote unquote intelligent capacity of drones is really in its interface capacity, I think, with policing technologies even more so. And that's, you know, that's, yeah, sorry, go.
Briefly on that, I think that links back to what I was saying earlier on about this idea of discrimination. That, you know, AI really comes to the fore and autonomy comes to the fore when it's not really about just launching as much indiscriminate force as possible. The temptation might be to think of that as, well, that's evidence of our kind of higher normative standards of war today. But I think the other answer is precisely that that you're getting at, which is really, this is also part of the blurring between war and policing that we see in today's world, where, I mean, the nature of policing is that it has to be discriminate in some shape or form, because it's not about destruction, it's about governance ultimately. So yes, just on that. I sense Michael wants to come in. I guess we have a few questions in the chat that maybe we should address.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Really fascinating so far. I have a load of questions, but I'll save most of them, I think, for and drop them in as we go along. I mean, one thing that struck me though, as you were both talking, is the feedback, the unpredictable feedback loops and relationships that arise between developments in military technologies, strategies, events, and so on and so forth. Like, you know, what Jairus was just talking about, for example, with, you know, what would be the response to a massive, perhaps almost insurmountable high-tech robot, killer robot force, might be to just go, well, stuff that, which like also seems to me in some ways to be one of the fundamental counter arguments to the idea that, you know, every major nation having lethal autonomous weapons would somehow make war like safer and friendlier, because then the robots would all like go off and fight each other, which of course, like, you know, which you know, of course, like the countries have never settled disputes by playing chess. So, you know, like not on that scale anyway. And so why would they, you know, have a game between robots essentially be the means of resolving conflict? And instead, like, you would look for the alternative response, you know, the way that steps outside of the logic of what is happening right now. And that in some ways seems to connect into some of the threads that you guys covered around what the kinds of problems that autonomous weapons and drones and military technology in general tries to manage, and also how that relates to developments in military thinking. So I'm sort of thinking in particular about like one of the sort of figures that hasn't circulated so much through the discussion yet, which is, you know, the emergent terrorist threat, right? You know, that there are these sort of threats out there that need to be dealt with before they arise, or as they arise, or in advance of their arising. And so in some ways, like this ties in, for me at least, into these questions of autonomy and automation quite significantly, because, you know, the structure of the militaries as top-down hierarchical systems doesn't handle that type of you know, unpredictable eruption or potentially unpredictable eruption of violence. And so, you know, the drone or the fighting unit, perhaps special forces unit or whatever, made autonomous, is perhaps in some ways like in in concert with those types of the imagining of those types of threats as sort of the major threats. No need to respond to my babble though. There are a couple of really great questions coming up in the chat, and I'll try to kind of organize them as we go along. So one thing that I think fits neatly with where we've just sort of ended up in relation to drones and sensing and wider environments and so on is from Adam Fish, who does a lot of research on drones from an ethnographic perspective, and he works on conservation and oceanography in relation to drones. And so Adam's asked for, there's surprisingly little being said so far about the ecologies, the savage ecologies perhaps, elements and other forces that drones sense. And so are the sensed others merely victims? And how do drones co-create with the elements they are suspended within and the agents they sense? I think this is maybe a really interesting question in the context of warfare. So yeah, if either of you have thoughts on that, would be great.
I could say a quick thing, which I think is a bit of a historical analog, which is, you know, in the mid 90s, relate through almost 2000, there was a huge effort to declassify particularly all the CIA satellite data of Southeast Asia, because it provided one of the most important baselines for not just deforestation, but also the loss of coral reefs, development, where development was taking place. And the irony was they still wouldn't let it go. So, you know, I mean, at the same time, they were arguing about whether or not to let go of maps about where they dropped bomblets and things like that in Laos. And, you know, I mean, it was a fight, but there has always been this dual use character and this sort of environmental character that could, if not be positive, at the very least, show us something about the kinds of change that not just war, but, you know, capital created in regions. And so, no, I don't think that the thing that's sensed is always a victim. But I do think more than I used to, that the opportunities for play, reversal, and resistance become increasingly difficult as humans lose contact with one another. And I know that sounds like a really nostalgic thing to say, but there's something, you know, maybe it's just been the fact that I've been living on Zoom for 7 months, but there is something about the encounter between people and other non-human animals, and I think even machines, the physical encounter. And this relates back to the sort of Andy Clark point that Antoine made of how extended minds work, right? Cognition is a collective enterprise, and it's not the same when it's mediated. It's not to say that it isn't also a collective enterprise, but I do believe that there are components which are not engaged in the same way in terms of the tactile, smell, all sorts of different ways that memories are formed. And so while I don't want to reduce the image or the sensed to merely an object in an uninteresting way, I think we would be remiss to not really think about the just like massive neurocognitive transformation that happens to soldiers, policymakers, citizens, activists, insurgents, when the narrowing of encounter takes place. And that, again, it is another kind of encounter, but I think it's one that is neurocognitively radically different. And so I've, you know, I don't know, I'm not so sure that, for instance, even so-called good drones, right, that really makes sense to me in that sense, because I want to know what kinds of publics they create, what kinds of multi-species economies they create. And I think they tend to narrow on two terms. One, which is they narrow the terms of encounter and engagement, but they also narrow the numbers of users. So I think about the number of times that human rights organizations and environmental organizations have made almost identical arguments to the argument the Vice Admiral of the Australian Navy actually made to me about why they wanted to get in the drone business. It's because it freed up so much time to do other things, right? Really what they meant is it freed up so much time to downsize to have fewer and fewer people involved. And so if you think that organizations are actually about building the process of peoples and communities and relations, then needing fewer isn't really an advantage. And so I think that actually cuts as close to the quick of war as it does of politics or other kinds of engagement. I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but hopefully it rhymes with the question.
I wanted to respond to sort of different line of thinking, some of the things that Jairus was saying in his previous comments, and yourself as well, Michael, which is, I mean, something that's close to our heart, to Jairus and I, and that we were, was that the impetus behind the special issue we edited with Nisha Shah and Security Dialogue on Becoming War, which is to think about, to ask the question of what it means to think about war as an autonomous realm in itself. So if we're going to think about autonomy as the giving itself of its own laws, can we think of war in this fashion? And I think this goes against the grain of a lot of social and political thinking, which sees war as derivative of other orders. It's a derivative of the economic, or the political, or the psychological, or whatever it might be. And of course, framing it in these ways raises different kinds of issues about how you might solve the problem of war. If we have a more equitable socioeconomic distribution, then war will go away. And our problems, therefore, do not have to be war-centric. Well, I think it's an important question to ask whether that's right, and whether the problem of war is not a deeper one. So what would it mean to, develop a kind of polymocentric form of thinking? And I think one of the questions for that would then be, well, if we want to treat war kind of as an autonomous realm, what would be its internal dynamic? And I think there's a good case to make that escalation. And you find that, in Clausewitz, our kind of philosopher king of war, who makes the pitch early on war that, war has a natural tendency to escalate towards the extremes. And really what acts as a brake on it, in terms of Clausewitz in his mind, is the kind of geographic, temporal, ultimately technical restrictions on war. Of course, many of these restrictions have since evaporated since he was writing in the early 19th century, which might well leave us with just the bare logic ever closer to being realized. We find this idea of escalation in the more contemporary work of Paul Virilio, of course, who, and through the form of speed and this kind of continual acceleration of society, which is driven in his mind primarily through the military, and what is more of an accelerator than basically the mutual escalation of belligerence. We find this in the work of Friedrich Kittler, who also sees the emergence of media are basically a product of war acceleration. So, we might want to think about that when we think about the evolution of drones or autonomous weapon systems or AI and so on, and how this fits into this wider historical tendency towards escalation within the war sphere, and what that might mean if we think more broadly of escalation as a key principle of technological and political development. And of course, that maybe raises the question of whether what we are dealing with are not kind of discrete militaries in the end, but a war system, a kind of globalized war machine in which, to use Deleuze-Guattari's phrase, states might become mere appendages to it, or in many cases also non-state actors. So I think that's a question that I think is important to us to think about, how we center this discussion on war, and what are the dynamics inherent to war that might account for some of the things that we're seeing, and where that might lead us to.
Thanks. Yeah.
Sorry. Go.
No, I was just going to commend the special issue the two of you and Nisha Shah edited of Security Dialogue. I'm guessing that a number of people at this seminar are familiar with it, but if you're not, it's really fantastic. And the introduction the three of them wrote on this idea of becoming war is quite powerful in kind of turning on its head some of the ways that we would understand war, perhaps as like an irregularity, and instead kind of repositions war, not to say it as like, well, we just have to accept that there's war all the time and that it sucks, but rather tries to just like shift the way we think about the relationship between war and other human structures and activities. Okay, so I did, maybe picking up on some of those themes that both of you have articulated in your responses. There's a question from Chris Agius, who asks, do you see a difference between agency and intention? And Chris has said here in the chat that she's thinking about this question in the context of post-human and new materialist readings of agency. So does agency and intention kind of function differently within these drone assemblages or apparatuses?
Antoine, you want me to go? You want to go?
Yeah, you go.
Yeah, obviously, in part because she was my advisor, but also just because her work was great. Like, I was in grad school when Jane Bennett was writing Vibrant Matter, and Bill Conley was working on the work that would sort of become the most new materialist of his work, right? So the sort of trilogy on becoming and the world. And there was a real discussion, I think, for more than a year about whether or not to hold on to the word agency at all. And Jane really made the decision to hold on to it. She didn't want to let it go. And her reason, I thought, was a very good one, which is that to, in some sense, give in to a certain post-humanist critique of agency was to undermine how much agency was this collective enterprise, right? So yes, we could sort of reject agency or even intentionality, which I'll get to in a second, if what we wanted to do was undermine the sort of enlightened subject. Or what we could do is show really just how unbelievably complex agency was, right? So, I always thought that was a really important move, and I thought was better in some sense than the sort of Latour move towards actants. I thought actants, I think, sort of bypasses trying to think about why it's not anthropomorphism to see agency all over the place. It's sort of anthropocentrism to not see it all over the place. So that's sort of part one. Part two is, Bill went through a similar thing with intentionality, decided for Nietzschean and Deleuzian reasons to hold on to the concept of will. And I think that will is actually a very important counterpart to intention. Intention, I think, requires too much self-reflection, which is almost always very late to the party. Right? We have all kinds of it, but it's generally the day later when we're like, oh, I really wish I had said that. That was my comeback. Right? Intentionality is I think it's a post hoc fallacy, but I think that will is a real force. And the Spinozist Whiteheadian, Isabel Stangerin and me says that will is a kind of drive towards creativity and to expenditure, which is another component of war, which we haven't really talked about. That a lot of people may be drawn to war in this kind of will of expenditure. I often wonder, for instance, in a dark way, how much the sort of neo-fascist resurgence in the United States is precisely because liberalism, in some sense, banned the capacity to think that acting out was something worthy of doing. And that's something that certainly the African-American community in the United States never forgot. But for those sort of racist enclaves that bought into a certain vision of post-political America, it's not surprising that the generation just after them came resurging back in the worst possible ways of wanting a fight on the streets, right? Think about the Boogaloos, for instance, in this case, who seem to want chaos more than they want a particular outcome. But a chaos framed within a really toxic white masculinity. So, even them, I'm not sure I would call them intentional, but they're willful. So I don't know, that's how I'd want to think about it, is that, I like new materialism when it thinks in terms of will and when it thinks in terms of agency as process, as opposed to a capability. I generally cop out and just use the term efficacy, but that's just because I'm not as bold as Jane. So.
I don't have anything to add to those comments other than to say that these questions of agency and intentionality are very complicated questions that we can't easily adjudicate. But that leads me to a broader point, I think, which is, this applies to questions of war, agency, and AI, which is to say that I think in many ways we're still at the stage of trying to ask the right questions. And regard to the theme, today's theme, I'll reference the campaign to ban killer robots, which I think is a very well-intentioned and noble enterprise, but I think it's going to miss the mark. It's just not going to achieve anything it wants to achieve, because the ability, the conceptual frameworks that are being used to campaign on this space, I think, are very poor fit for the reality we face. AI is not, it's going to be very difficult to draw the lines in the ways that this campaign and wants to do so. That might be frustrating to say that really we're not at the point of we're still at the point of having to ask the right questions, and might sound terribly academic to say so, but given the perilous situations we find ourselves in today, we might want to be able to act now, but I do think that we are still grappling to understand the reality, that the emergent reality, and if we don't ask the right questions, if we don't have the right conceptual tools, I don't think we're going to get much of a grasp on it.
Switching gears just slightly, Mitch Goodwin asks whether we can consider code, so bots, executables, virals, and so on, that are stealthy and lie in wait, that swarm across networks. Can we think of these kinds of things as drones or drone-like, even though they might not, I suppose, have the material encasing?
Yes, but no. No, I mean, I think this is one of those moments where I wish the drone weren't quite so much the center of the conversation, because the reality is drones are only doing more interesting things than they were doing in World War II, precisely because of that litany of different kinds of interactive informatic capabilities, which can be communicated at speeds such that they could be transferred from materially encased thing to another materially encased thing. And so I would rather not think of them as drones so much as think about a rainforest-like ecology of new informatic entities, which maybe spend some time in drones, help design drones, help do experiments so that drones don't crash, change the machine vision of the drone. This actually gets to the second question Mitch asked about art. Like, is there a role for art in war? This is precisely the role of art in war. I mean, the reality is that a lot of these algorithms and a lot of these bots, like, they're promiscuous, to say the least, right? They're as useful in generating art as they are in generating war, and vice versa. And I don't have a strong sense of that. I'll only say that when Lilly was developing the machine brain interfaces and the isolation tanks and the dolphin attack programs, he was doing it because he was convinced that learning to communicate with dolphins was the only way to get outside the anthropocentric circle and really get at the tough questions Heidegger was trying to ask. Because until we could interview another intelligent species about ourselves, philosophy was at a dead end. The fact that he could have that idea at the same time that he was torturing animals and humans and developing one of the most sophisticated arms of the war machine, and hoping without hope that machine wouldn't just allow us to interview dolphins, but that it would make us capable of being able to interview aliens if we ever encountered them, because it was about trying to bridge cognitive capacities, which were radically different. And I will say another one, an Andean culture that mostly used whistles because there was not enough oxygen often for language. So he was also interested in, like, radically different human forms of life. But that sat so comfortably in a lab filled with monkeys with things screwed into their heads. I don't know. Art and war is not a fine line, I think.
It's funny when I started, researching and thinking about drones several years ago. I had this, my initial, thought was like, oh, how many things can we call a drone? And how many things are drone-like? But actually, like, the longer I've read and thought and kind of and researched into these things, that seems to me to be a question that, for me anyway, like, you end up just chasing your tail in a way, because it doesn't actually, what that does ends up doing is kind of repeating. It traps you analytically, because you're then you're then caught within a desire to kind of frame things according to a keyword, which is actually a problematic keyword anyway, because, you know, we all, as you both in different ways started this talk with, like, let's not obsess over the drone. And yet, so if we're looking for drone-like and drone objects and so on, drone logics and so on, can be a risky path to go down. Antoine, did you want to hop in?
Yes, I mean, to abandon this direction, I think our categories are too broad. You know, the drone is, the drone is too broad a category, or the question of AI is too broad. And yes, we've been talking in kind of very broad brush terms today, and now we can say some general things, but ultimately, you know, the kind of empiricism that we advocate in the Becoming War special issue is precisely to kind of get our hands dirty and to really get into the specifics of socio-technical systems, and military ones in particular. So with regard to, you know, software or viruses or other forms of malware or code, I don't think we should come to them with the preconception that we know what a drone is and we're gonna layer this on top of the analysis. We need to understand the specificity of the forms of code that we're looking at, what forms of behavior that they have, what kinds of ecologies they participate in, and associated is the question of whether they are intelligent or not. I think to me to be a little bit of a kind of a blind alley. We should just think about what they actually do, and leave the kind of metaphysics of intelligence and sentience to the side on that basis. So yes, we're very much in favor of kind of broad, kind of speculative theory, but also conjugated with kind of a attention to detail. In fact, to my mind, one of the biggest challenges we face as a civilization, and I mean this in the kind of most broad sense possible, is we need to kind of we need to bridge the gap between the technical cultures and the kind of wider sphere of the humanities. Within the humanities, social sciences, we've got a kind of long critical tradition of technology, but a lot of it remains at a distance and with amount of generality. And if we don't reconnect more broadly as a culture between the technical side, if we don't have technicians thinking about these big philosophical normative issues, and if we don't have the philosophers, the thinkers, and those the wider populace grapple with technical specificity, then I think we're very unlikely to be able to overcome or face the challenges that we encountering today.
Yeah, thank you. Which is of course not to kind of discard the value in finding likeness and similarity and so on, I suppose. I've got a question from Ari Eisenstadt, who asks, what are the implications of quantum computing with drones, or perhaps with war more generally, and is there a good way that it could be regulated, do you think? And I'll just flag that we've got a few questions and about 10 minutes to go, so we'll if we try and keep our responses tighter.
I'll be very fast on quantum computing. I think it'll have very little impact on drones. I think that what quantum computing is good at is increasingly in regards to the technologies that spin off from the computing. So the ability to control more supple scales of matter. The one area of that which I do think will significantly impact drones is not necessarily good, which is that quantum computing research has allowed us to expand the detail of the electromagnetic spectrum, which allows for forms of communication and radio signaling and jamming, which could, I think, be pretty catastrophic or incredibly eruptively productive for drones. But I don't think it's going to have a real impact on the artificial intelligence. But that's just my gut. It's big centralized computers as opposed to big network systems. Quantum computing is a big centralized computer, therefore I don't think it's going to produce as much as big network systems.
And Doug Kahn asks, diesel electric subs promised lesser state players to submerge undetected nuke sub-style weapons long enough to threaten naval invasions and shipping lanes and so on. Is there an equivalent for lesser state, non-state actors, etc., in potential pack behaviors or uses for drones and in drone futures?
Well, to just address that question in general terms, there's no doubt that drone technology is already trickling down to non-state actors, and it's not a technology that states will hold a monopoly on. I mean, there's a general trend that we're faced with, which is that the technical advances are in many ways is raising the kind of well, lowering, if you want, the barriers to entry into organized violence. And this is not a new story. We could already see that in the prevalence of civil war or civil strife in parts of the world where effectively very limited numbers of malcontents with automatic machine guns can create significant problems, which is why the process, kind of the virtuous process, if you want to look at it that way, between state formation and the development of military force in the early modern period is one that's not necessarily going to be replicated going forwards. So there's no doubt that the technology is not one that will be held for very long, or is being held for very long by state actors, unlike, say, perhaps nuclear weapons, which would be another example. But even then, I think, again, this kind of categories are too crude, because it really, if we extend this to the question of artificial intelligence, again, I think we get a variegated picture. If we think about quantum computing that we just raised, that's going to remain largely a state monopoly for a long time, because it's very expensive, it requires large installations and so on and so forth. And we still don't know exactly what quantum computing will deliver, but if it delivers major artificial intelligence breakthroughs, these are not ones that are going to be easily accessible to non-state actors. On the other hand, many processes are already available to actors, to non-state actors, whether it's data mining or the generation of fake imagery and so on. So I think we can't speak in too broad terms. We have to be quite specific here.
Yeah, I'll just throw in quickly that North Korea bootstrapped its own drone program entirely from scratch. It doesn't seem to have depended on other drones, and it did it relatively quickly. So if we were to compare, for instance, getting something to escape velocity to enter the atmosphere versus drone capability, it's apples and oranges in terms of the amount of capital investment and technical capability. So it's diesel subs to the power of 100 in terms of expansion and accessibility.
Yeah, and there's the Bill Arkin has a really great book, like popular trade book, I guess, about the development of drone systems and data systems in contemporary war that really does show like just the level of ad hoc bootstrapping that even occurred in the US system, and the strain that put on bandwidth and network infrastructures and so on, which sort of tells you, I think, a lot about the how we ended up where we are technologically with drones right now. Catherine Brimblecombe-Fox asks, what would thinking about censored drone or robot sensing rather than using sense, how would that change perceptions of drone capabilities and human reactions and interactions with them? So I guess this is a question about maybe like not collapsing sensing as a kind of human phenomena into what the technological can do, and that as a sensor or as sensed.
Antoine, you want to go first? What would I want to say about that? I think in part, this is another one of these places where I don't want metaphors to be the driving force. So we like to call machine vision because what it does is it does something like seeing, but it doesn't actually do something like seeing at all. And it also enables all kinds of different capacities that we would never possibly have. And so this is the empiricist streak in Antoine and myself, which is I want us to start thinking each machine event on its own terms. And so I think we would do well to spend a lot of time, and this is where I think art actually plays a really significant role, to create phenomenological experiences for humans, to experience both the limitations and capacities of machines sensorially, how disorienting it is, or what gets seen. And I think opportunities to do that and to build those kinds of human-machine interfaces, you know, it doesn't necessarily put ethics in the right direction, but it gives us something to work with in even having the conversation in the first place that we're just not having, right? So, you know, conversations about discrimination really only make sense if you can see like a drone. I would rather see research develop there to bring that very question to the fore than to try to figure out how we could sort of conceptually deconstruct what we meant by censored or censoring, which I think is probably what she's up to because she makes really cool art. So.
All right. Well, I think we've hit the end of the questions that folks have submitted, and it's 6:25 here in Sydney, and I think that makes it 10:25 in Hawaii and 9:25 in London. We've managed to thread the needle time-wise, but we've also coming to the end of our time. So I will just, I think I'll wrap it up here and say thank you all very much for joining us today and for the rich discussion. Really interesting and really interesting to do it in this dialogue format too. So please do come along to others in our Drone Futures series. The next seminar is at 11 a.m. on Wednesday, the 23rd of September, that's Sydney time. And we'll be joined by Kate Chandler from Georgetown University. She's a feminist, STS, and media studies scholar, and she's the author of a really terrific book called Unmanning: How Humans, Machines, and Media Perform Drone Warfare. And I think that her book and I think that her talk will pick up on some of the themes, particularly from earlier in the conversation between Antoine and Jairus about the long history and also the stories of technological failure and so on that populate the story of drones. And then after Kate, we have Jen Schnepf, Thomas Stubblefield, and Mawish Chishti. So there's lots of really great seminars to come. You can register for almost all of them, and there's a link below the video to a page which has got info about all the seminars. So you can just follow that link. And if you're on Twitter, you can also follow us at Richardson_M_A in my case, or Antoine at AJ Bousquet, and Jairus at Savage Ecology. Jairus clearly with the much cooler handle than either of us. And if you like this talk, please do spread the word. The link you're using now will become a regular YouTube video in the very near future. And we'll be releasing this talk along with a separate interview on the Media Futures Hub podcast. And that you can find a link to the podcast in the video description as well if you want to, if you'd like to subscribe. We'll also be sending out this link to everybody who registered for the talk today. So thank you, Madeline, for moderating the chat, and thank you, Antoine and Jairus, for a stimulating talk. And above all, thank you all for tuning in for this virtual seminar in the Drone Futures series and offering such thoughtful and insightful questions. So stay safe, stay strong, and take care of one another. Be well, everybody.